and click out of stream. See, you can't see me?
You can't see me very well either.
You're better than me.
I'm black on
Things
black.
I go out.
What's up, bud?
Not too much.
Dave wore a green shirt, so he won't be joining us today.
I've got a meeting to do.
He's got a meeting also, but it sounds better when I just say he had a green shirt.
Yes, it does. It does
And it should
indeed.
be bouncing
You're
off hills.
invisible. How you doing, bud?
Doing all right.
Good.
Had, very, very, very sad news yesterday. I sold my minivan after 18 years and 1 month of ownership. It's like a part of the family being.
How are you going to pull through that?
I don't think I am. I think I'm going to call the guy up and tell him I'll pay him twice as much to bring it back. So.
Do you need a safe room, a safe space where you can just be with your emotions and.
It's just funny because my whole family, the cool thing is that it was the vehicle my two sons came home from the hospital with, and they both learned to drive on it. So neat story there, But I put it on Craigslist. I was trying to trade it in because I thought I'd get, a better tax thing for it, but that didn't work out. So I put it on Craigslist, and I just put 2004 Toyota in need of good home. And I was, within an hour, I was bombarded with like 12 offers. But this guy, he's a mechanic for the post office, and the car had some issues with it. So I said and he was fine with all that. But his brother-in-law was in an ATV accident about 6 months ago, and he's now confined to a wheelchair because he just can't walk. Right? He can still drive, but anyway, and he's got a 5-year-old daughter. And he goes, "Yeah, we bought him this system that'll fit in the back of a minivan, that reaches out and grabs the wheelchair and all that sort of stuff." And he goes, "We just couldn't afford the minivan." And I said, "You know what? I'm just glad she's going to a good home because everybody else was going to scrap her or, part her out." I'm like, "Nope, I'm just, so pretty happy." But my kids were there and we were all pretending to cry as he drove away. And the guy's like, "This isn't any fun."
We're running live right now, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Let's go.
So welcome everybody again to our second edition of SafeDefend. And I think we talked a little bit about this last week, Doug, but I'm joined today by Director of Training for SafeDefend, excuse me, Doug Parisi. Doug's a lifelong law enforcement officer. And I don't think I said this last week, but I wanted to just thank you publicly for your service in that area. I think that's one of the 3 or 4 professions that I've always said are callings. You're not, you don't do those for the money or for any other reason.
Yeah,
you do it because you're called to do it. And so I really do sincerely appreciate that. And then you're continuing your service by making our kids and people in government buildings, whether they're schools, government offices, military bases, private businesses, continuing to work to make them safe and have a good life. So I appreciate that.
Well, I thank you. Thank you for that recognition. I really appreciate that.
No, it's important. I think we do that for all of our brothers and sisters in blue or in uniform, or our first responders of any kind, or teachers, firefighters, or just all of them are just, you guys put something on the line every day that nobody else really does. So I really do appreciate that. So Doug, we've always said we want this to be educational driven. We're going to try to give folks that listen real world scenarios and solutions. Of course, we always encourage everybody to go to SafeDefend.com and check it out and reach out to Doug directly as Director of Training if you have any questions, or if you think there's anything you'd like to talk to Doug about coming out and working with your employees, or whether it's your teachers, your support staff, your administration, or it's your office workers, your manufacturing plant workers. Hospitals are a great, unfortunately, just in last year, there was a tragic mass shooting inside a hospital in the States. And, so unfortunately, this is a reality, right? Bad people do bad things, and good people pay the price. And SafeDefend's mission is to try to educate and help people to make their environments, whatever that is, as safe as possible. So let's talk through a couple of these. Yesterday we were in a meeting with, we had the founder of SafeDefend, Jeff Green. We were in some meetings with him and some other business owners yesterday. And one of the gentlemen in there has a very interesting background. And I don't have his permission to identify him specifically, so I won't, but I am going to get that permission. I think I'm going to actually want him to come on and be a guest, Doug, at some point, because he's just a real knowledgeable gentleman. But they work with hospitals all over the United States. And this is the interesting thing. They work inside prisons. Is some of their clients, they do government work, right? So they provide services inside prisons for the inmates. And this is a guy that people work inside a prison, said they need stuff like this inside the prisons. Now you wouldn't think that, right? I mean, it's a prison. It's supposed to be locked down, but there are unfortunately these things called uprisings and riots and just day-to-day bad stuff that happens that a lot of times nobody ever hears about. So again, just to kind of kick us off, are you comfortable breaking down some of the more prominent, unfortunate shooting situations in schools and walking through those? Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, that's certainly something that I've done a lot of research on.
Yeah.
One of the things that is very interesting is when you look at the transition that I made from law enforcement to working in the private sector. But when the big issue for all of us was, if you paid attention to it, was when the FBI came out with their report in 2013 talking about active shooters and some of the statistics that came out from that. But the biggest issue that we have to understand is that there's always a gap between the time an incident starts until law enforcement is notified. Sometimes that gap is just moments because the officer is within earshot and they hear the first shots, or sometimes it can be up to minutes because they're not even on scene. And so when we look at some of the incidents that have happened, just over, say, the last decade, we don't have to sit there and say this is what might happen because we know what is going to happen. Even with an SRO in the building, which gives everybody a huge sense of safety and security and all that. Understand that that SRO is generally only in that building about 60 to 70% of the time. And that comes from the national, the NASRO study that came out, or it was a report that came out several years ago, that by the time that they start doing their paperwork, by the time they go to meetings, by the time they take days off, when you add up how much time they're actually in that building when the school is in operation, then it's only about 60% of the time. The other stuff we have to look for is a lot of these schools open at 7 o'clock, and then with intramural sports and activities, they're open till 5, 6, 7 o'clock. But that SRO is generally only there for eight of those hours. They're not even there on the weekend. So when you start to kind of figure out what's going on, you realize there's a huge gap of time when we don't even have a responder in that building. But our assumption is that they are there.
Hey, Doug, real quick. Let me ask you this real quick. Share with our guest. Once the SafeDefend system is activated, how long does it take to notify the authorities? How long before they receive a message?
About 3 to 5 seconds is when they're going to be getting a text and email alert, giving them specific information down to the classroom number, the address of the building, the name of the building, but also which is the closest entrance, access point to the area that the crisis is happening. So if you think of some of these large high schools that we have with multiple floors and stuff like that, sometimes the front entrance is not the best one. But if the officers are just given that address, that's where they're going to show up. But if all of a sudden we say northeast, corner entrance by the gym, they're going to know exactly where the closest entrance is to get into that building, to get to the classroom or the area where there's a crisis.
And on average, how long does the average historically, and unfortunately we have tons of data on this, but what's the average length of an active shooter?
Under 3 minutes is the vast majority of the casualties occur in the first 3 minutes, and a good law enforcement response time is considered 4 or 5 minutes. And that's the gap that we're trying to bridge.
Right. So bottom line, they're typically over before they can get there.
Correct. And so then you were talking historically, and I'll just name off a few, but even the situations like Parkland or Santa Fe, New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, all of these shootings that we've had, the Sped High School, the Augustine High School in California, all of these shootings that we've had, the casualties have been inflicted in under the first minute, and law enforcement is there just to kind of clean up the mess. And I don't mean that so casually, but that's really what we've got, is that we just don't have the ability to get law enforcement there quicker. And let me just put this in context. If you go over and pull the fire alarm in a building, the dispatcher knows exactly where in that building that alarm has been pulled. And the firefighters, if they have the updated CAD system, they get that directly sent to their in-car computer or in-truck computer. So they know where to go as they're driving there. And so they know exactly which entrance to go to and get to that fire as quickly as possible. When you pick up at the phone and call 911, and there are so many 911 calls that we play for training, but the vast majority of the time, they're in such a panic, all they can say is the name of the high school. Parkland is a prime example of that. It was a 45-acre campus with 13 buildings on it. There's no way law enforcement can cover that in a reasonable amount of time. With a system like SafeDefend, any teacher in that building could have put their fingerprint down onto the device, and it would have said room 1234, building 12, northeast corner of the campus, and they would have known exactly where to go. And that's what we need to be able to do.
So let me ask you this. Statistically, I believe, it's been it's been years and years and years since we've had a death due to fire in a public school. Is that true? 1958
was the last fire fatality in the United States.
Okay. Now, part of that is because of new technologies. You just talked about. You're giving good intel, if you will, to the fire department so they know where to go to attack the threat. Right.
Right.
Part of that is you do drills. Most schools, I think it's monthly, probably. They do a fire drill at depending on the level of the school, but as far as age group. So
let me say something real quick on those drills. That was the pivotal thing. If you think that the last fire fatality was in 1958, we still had school fires for years after that. But the training had kicked in to the point that teachers knew how to exit those buildings, the students knew how to exit those buildings and all that. When we look at the study that just came out of Idaho that showed that in a school shooting, the best place for your students to be is behind that locked door, that comes down with training. That comes down with where do they need to be in the classroom? What do those kids need to do? Teachers need to get that door locked, get those lights out, and get out of view themselves. And so that's where those drills are so important, which is part of why the SafeDefend system doesn't just put in an alarm and say, there, you're on your own. We come through with the training. We make sure you're doing the drills. We make sure you change up the drills so it's not always the same type of scenario. And that is what is going to make a difference in these situations, is that there is something called first responders, which are your fire and police, but there's immediate responders. And those immediate responders are your teachers and staff that can get that building notified that there's a threat, and they can get that building in lockdown in seconds.
I get asked this a lot since we've started partnering with SafeDefend and working with you guys. And as we talk to people out in public about it, they'll say, well, why don't we just arm the teachers? That would solve this.
I'm a big supporter of Second Amendment rights, but I don't think in this situation.
Me too.
Right. I don't want to say it. I don't think in this situation that's the answer. And there's a couple components to this that people don't always take into account. The first is that teacher has a direct responsibility to the 20 to 30 students in their class to protect them. If they were to go into that hallway and try and take out that shooter, there is nothing that is going to be more detrimental to that class than to lose their leader, which is what has happened. That leader might win that fight, but unfortunately, as we've seen, even in law enforcement, we don't win every fight. And when we look at Parkland, there were several teachers that attempted to do exactly what you're talking about, and they lost their lives doing that. And that was
heroically,
very much so, very noble, very valorous for them to do that. But what's unfortunate in that situation is, we look at it and say, could they have saved lives maybe by being on the notification, by getting that building locked down or something like that? And so that's what we have to look at. The other thing you're talking about is somebody, and I know you're well-trained, I'm well-trained. Most people feel very confident with their weapon. But and I'm just going to take Parkland because that's the most prolific example right now. You're talking about taking a handgun, stepping into a hallway with maybe 12 or 15 rounds of ammunition if you have a semi-auto, or 6 if you're carrying a revolver, against a determined attacker who has 180 rounds of ammunition and an AR-15 with a 30-round magazine, and you're in a long hallway with them. Odds are they're going to be the one that's going to win that fight. And then the third thing that we look at is there was a shooting years ago back in the early 2000s in Wisconsin. And there was a police officer that saw this kid who was bullied and he was upset. And I think he was 13 years old. And he started shooting at kids in this courtyard. And that police officer ran about 70 feet and tackled this kid. And one of the things that the officer was asked was, why didn't you shoot him? And he said, man, I know that kid. I have it in my heart that I can, I just couldn't do it. I'm here to protect those kids and all that. And what I would tell you is everybody always thinks of this evil, mean shooter that comes in the building. But the more likelihood is there's some victim or somebody that has a mental health problem that it's direct knowledge that all the staff feel empathy for this person. It's not so easy to just pull out a gun and take somebody out like that. And that's what people don't always understand.
My wife is a career educator. She's a classroom teacher. That's one reason why when I first heard of SafeDefend, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it really resonated with me because, the person I love the most in this world, who's most precious to me, gets up every day and goes to a classroom. And, I may not be the brightest bulb in the old drawer, but I'm smart enough to know that that's a soft target. Right. It is. And so you worry about those things. And my wife, who is very skilled with weapons, very skilled, to your point, my wife teaches special education. And I asked her one time that very question, could you do this if you had to? Now, this is a lady that during the Gulf War made the selections on who was going to get bombed that night. So she's not a wallflower, right? She's not somebody she's made real world decisions that literally were life and death in her life. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She said, there's no way I could shoot one of my babies. There's no way.
And so that's where we look into those things. It's a great situation, but there was a teacher, I believe in Oregon, that disarmed an active shooter with a hug. And when they asked her, they asked her, why did you hug someone? He goes, well, when I told him to put the gun down, but my biggest fear was that the police were going to show up and, overreact in that situation as somebody that was trying to surrender. So I knew if I was hugging him that they wouldn't be able to do that. And understand, in law enforcement, we're not there to take the life of anybody. No, we're there to protect civilians and stop the hostile aggression. We call it neutralizing the shooter. But neutralizing that shooter might be getting them pinned down into a classroom where they're locked up by themselves or flushing them from the building. It's not always about using physical force on them. And so even in law enforcement, our goal is to take people in custody and allow the justice system to work. It's not to show up and do that. And that's what you understand is that there are just some times where the best thing for a teacher to do is to get that door locked. Aztec, New Mexico, you had a janitor when the kid, unfortunately, a student walked into the bathroom where the shooter had snuck into this 21-year-old had snuck into the high school. And upon killing that person, the janitor started running down the hallway yelling, active shooter, lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. And everybody got locked down. And the shooter was walking up and down the hallway, unfortunately confronted a girl that had shown up late to school. She lost her life as well. But nobody else was in the hallways, and there was nobody else, no other victims other than people, unfortunate situations. But they were able to get that whole building on lockdown. And that's the goal. And so SafeDefend, when you activate the system, when you put your finger down there, not only is it texting law enforcement officers, it's texting the rest of the building so they know where the threat is. If you're on the 3rd floor at Parkland and something's happening on the 1st floor, you know not to leave your building because you're going to have to potentially run past the shooter. But if it's happening on the 3rd floor and you get a text and you're down there on the 1st floor, you may take your students and exit that building because you have time to get out before that shooter can get downstairs. The same thing can be said for sirens and strobes that immediately go off so students know to head into this nearest classroom and the teachers know to initiate that lockdown.
Well, because, and this is something too, people, I watched the documentary on the Parkland shooting. And it's hard to watch, but it's also something I think everybody should watch because to me, if you're paying attention to how the progression of events, and hindsight's 20/20, right? I mean, we always talk about things after the fact, But something as simple as they're like, well, why are those people walking down the stairs if they hear the gunshots? First of all, you don't know what they are.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about Parkland is nobody died on the second floor because they heard the gunshots from the first floor and they were able to get locked down and out of sight. Unfortunately, the gunpowder and the debris from the ceiling tiles set off the fire alarm for about 28 seconds. So the people on the third floor didn't hear the gunshots. So they came out. But this is where I'm, I don't want to, like you said, I don't want a Monday morning quarterback, but I do wonder what a notification system in an active shooter situation would have done to that school. Because if the teachers had gotten a notification that there's an active shooter and then a couple seconds later gotten a fire alarm, they might have thought, hey, I'm not smelling smoke. The building's not warm. I'm probably going to lock down because I just got noticed this. So those lives on that third floor had the ability to protect themselves. They had the time to protect themselves if they had information. And that's what's so important is that if you're not getting out good information to your entire staff or the entire campus, that's how lives are lost. And when we look at things like Santa Fe, Texas, they had 2 school resources off in the building, but somebody had to call 911 to then get dispatch, give the information to dispatch, and then dispatch had to try and raise them on the radio. All of this while this horrendous thing is happening, and all the students were telling them was at the high school because they didn't think it was important enough to say in the art classroom or whatever. So this SROs are running around the main body of the building looking for where this shooting is, right? Marshall County, Kentucky, the SRO was out front directing traffic early in the morning, and this was going on the inside of the building. And it wasn't until students ran out screaming, and then he looked over and said, what's going on? And they said, someone's shooting, that he ran inside. And so these are the type of things that you can understand where if a teacher could put their fingerprint down on a device and it sends off siren strobes, starts to text dispatch, texts and emails everybody in the building, and texts and emails SRO, within 3 seconds, that SRO that's out directing traffic would have gotten a notification that there's something violent happening inside that building, and he would have known exactly where to go in that building.
And getting people in the classrooms, because I don't believe in any of the shootings a classroom's ever been directly penetrated, correct?
So just so you know, Red Lake, Minnesota, they had that side window, which is about the 8-inch window, but there was nothing, there was no mesh, there was nothing that slowed down. And there was a shooter that was able to gain access to a classroom from there. That was the one where a very heroic 15-year-old boy took after him with a pencil. He was shot several times, but then the shooter was able, fled out of the classroom and was engaged by a police officer. But he did gain access to that window. What's interesting is that with proper training, you can prevent anyone from accessing your classroom through a window like that. And with things like we have at the SafeDefend system, things like a baton and stuff, you use that to prevent anyone from ever accessing that door handle to try and get in or anything like that. It's called threshold protection. You can do that without ever exposing yourself to danger. That's the type of situation. But yes, you're correct. The FBI has shown us that no active shooter has ever breached an interior locked door. You see it in the movies all the time where people they use a gun to shoot out a doorknob. All you're doing is breaking the mechanism. It doesn't release the tumbler, and it doesn't open the door. And you'd have to be a really good machine gun shot in order to do that little half U thing to shoot out the door handle the way you see it in the cartoons. Well, so getting that door locked is important.
I call it John Wayne syndrome, right? You watch enough movies, you think you can do anything or anything's possible. And the reality is reality is different.
Right.
Another point I think it's really important is when the notification goes off, and this is important, whether you have this, if you are ever in an active shooter situation, let's say you don't have a, quick response system, you don't have that, get into a locked room and lock the door.
Correct.
2 things are happening. Number 1, everything we just talked about. But number 2, you're clearing the halls of innocent people, of people that aren't the good people. And so when the first responders, or if they have an SRO and they're on building and they go to engage, they're not worried about friendlies in the halls or so get out of the way. Get out of the way. I mean, I think that's something that we've got to understand. Is and it is counterintuitive to you always talk about fight or flight, and I think people are born with an instinct. They're either fight or they're flight, and I was born with a double dose of fight, right? And when I first went in the military, it was very hard for me because my first instinct was to hit everything head on every time. and that's an easy way to die. I mean, you gotta think is you gotta put yourself in a situation to think clearly, right?
Right.
Some people are more naturally inclined to think clearly in pressure situations than others. You've seen it. You ran the police academy in Kansas City. You've seen it, right?
Correct.
I've seen it in the military where we do, guys that were great in classrooms. They were great in dry, non-live fire exercises. And then the first time they got in a live fire exercise, they curled up in a ball and couldn't function. It doesn't make them any less of a person. It just means that that's something that there's some natural inclinations in those kind of situations. Right. So when you have people trying to, you got to understand, get into a safe room, lock the door if you can, and wait for the good guys to get there. Right. I mean, that is, wouldn't you agree? That's one of the safest things we can do. One of the best things we can do.
That is hands down the best thing that a civilian can do in order to be out of the way of the responding officers is to get on the other side of a locked or barricaded door, for sure, every time. Right. One of the things I want to talk about, kind of just, you reminded me of it when we were talking about, one of the things that people have a tendency to do is that we, we're kind of homogeneous in the sense that like we think of high school as in like the high school we grew up in or the high school that our kids go to. But understand that these, like Parkland is the best example. It was 13 different buildings. But that's because they're down in Florida and they don't have to worry about snow and things like that. They just had awnings for when it rains. But I've been all across the South, everything from Las Vegas all the way across to Alabama. And I've seen buildings that, have the open air space where the classroom opens to the outside world. And so that's a very difficult thing. So when we look at these sort of things, you can't always sit there and say, well, let's do access control or let's do, window laminates or well, let's do this. And but what is that helping in these situations? Understand that the number one thing, regardless of what you want to be able to do, whether it's an open air building, whether it's separate buildings, whether or not it's one giant high school, whatever it is, you have to alert the people in that building that they are under threat. And then they can do exactly what you're talking about is getting barricaded, getting on the other side of that door. If without any good information, we have seen time and time and again that people become unwitting victims. I'll use the example of the recent mall shooting. And what was unfortunate in that situation is that later on, the shooter, he unfortunately took out the security guard first, which prevented them the ability to alert everybody else or to put the building on lockdown or to activate their emergency protocols. But there were people that were shopping in the stores and they come walking out of their stores and had no idea anything was happening. That's how big these buildings are. It's gunshots around a corner sound like somebody with a hammer. People don't understand that your proximity to that violence determines what you interpret that to be. You and I have heard gunshots. If we heard them within 50 feet of us, we'd know what they were. 250 feet around three corners in a high school, we're like, who's doing what? Is somebody banging a locker or who's slamming a door or whatever?
What is that? Yeah. I mean, I think too, I think we're, you talked about, the open air, educational spaces and the climates that allow that, which sounds cool. It sounds amazing for a learning environment, but from a safety environment, there's a lot of holes in that, obviously. But I think, this is the thing. I've talked to a lot of my friends that are in education. I've talked to some of the administrators at different schools my wife's worked at. I think there's one of the biggest challenges is a false sense of that'll never happen here. Right. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have. And the other is well, we have a great security system, get in and out, we got an SRO and, and I get it. And these people are well-intended. They want their kids to be safe. I'm not suggesting they don't care, but the mass majority of shooters are supposed to be in the building.
Correct. And that's what the FBI has shown us, that 86% of school shooters are students. And then another 10% of them are either faculty or staff or domestic partners of the people, and they know how to get into those buildings. Only about 4% of active shooters in this country have been people that had no access to that building. So all of your access control cameras work. In law enforcement, we always said surveillance cameras are good for two things: training videos and prosecutions, because they've never been shown to actually stop an active shooter. They're great for things like bullying and fights and thefts and vandalism, But in an active shooter situation, they actually slowed down the response in Parkland. And that's what we have to start looking at, is what's our priority? And our priority is to save lives. And if that's what you are focused on, then what you need to do is say notification is where it's at. And that is the most important thing. Understand that if, you know, I tell people this all the time, but I said there is not a single app or computer program or anything like that that a fire marshal in the United States has signed off on because they're not reliable enough. Not enough people have it on their phone. Not enough people know how to access their computer. In a crisis, the first thing to go is fine motor skills and your cognitive abilities. So now you can't remember passwords. You can't manipulate keys. You can't type in passwords. Whatever it is, what can you do? Take your finger and put it down on an activation module, or you can walk over and pull a fire station. So if the fire marshals don't trust these alternate systems for their fires, I'm not sure why schools are relying on them to say, yep, in an active shooter situation where somebody's shooting at me and I have 3 priorities, I need to get the building on lockdown, I need to notify law enforcement, I need to protect my students in my classroom. You're supposed to do all of those things while dialing 911 or trying to use your phone on an app. Like, nope, it needs to be single stage, put your finger down, system goes off, notification goes out to everybody exactly where they're needing the building. Alarms are going off throughout the building. Students know to go to the nearest classroom and lock down. That's how simple SafeDefend is.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're going to wrap it up here, but I'd like for you to, if you could, just some closing thoughts on it. And again, I want to encourage everybody, you know, reach out to Doug. He'll answer any questions you have. You know, if you're looking for a great resource to come help make your kiddos, your staff, your support staff, just the folks in there more, you know, as safe as they can be, talk to Doug about getting them out to do some training on professional development days at schools, things like this. They can do some really good things. But Doug, I'm going to give you final thoughts before we sign off today.
Well, I want to understand that there's no one solution that's ever going to solve the school safety security problem. But understand it's all about the layers. But you have to understand what those layers do. Access controls and cameras, they protect certain things, but they're not good in active shooter situations. The most important thing that you have to understand is that notification and response are something that need to be taught to your teachers. They need to have an understanding of what their response is. If that response is simply locking the door and shutting off the lights, that's good. If you have an SRO in the building, then they just need to get them notified. What we have to understand is that there are priorities in this, though. Although it's layered, the priority is, number one, I have to get law enforcement notified and I have to get the building safely locked down. If you're not doing that, all of your cameras, your access controls, and all your stuff, you're failing yourself, because those other things will protect property. The SafeDefend system will protect lives.
Doug, I appreciate you very much, brother. And again, we do this every Friday at 9:30 Central Time. Go to the SafeDefend YouTube page. You can check out you know, all kinds of different videos there, as well as our Facebook Live events. We're going to be adding a podcast that Doug doesn't even know about yet, because I haven't had a chance to talk to him about it. But we're going to be doing some pretty cool things with the mission in mind of making people safer out in the world, so that you get to go home at night with your families and you know, enjoy your life. So, Doug, thank you again, and we'll see you next Friday at 9:30 here with SafeDefend.
Thank you, Phil.
All right, Doug.